Okay. Welcome everyone to StabilityHub's webinar, Sample Transport, Validation and Control. We would encourage you to turn your camera on if possible, but stay muted unless you are asked to comment further on a question. This session is being recorded and will be available in the articles and videos section at stabilityhub.com. Today's webinar begins with a presentation courtesy of the fine folks at Q1 Scientific, a Cambrex company, and leading provider of environmentally controlled cGMP stability storage services for the pharmaceutical, medical device, and life science industries. They have facilities located in Waterford, Ireland, Liège, Belgium, and Durham, North Carolina in the US. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions as they occur to you, and they will be answered approximately in the order received. If desired, you can address your question to a specific speaker or panel member. As time permits, there is an additional Q&A period toward the end of the hour. In the absence of your questions, we've assembled an interesting array of frequently asked questions. I'd like to introduce our speakers and the member of today's panel. Our presenters are Aideen Glynn, Quality Manager at Q1 Scientific in Waterford, Ireland, and Amy Trinchard, Director of U.S. Operations, Q1 Scientific in Durham, North Carolina. Our panel members are Emily Dickinson, Director of Quality Assurance at Linical, a clinical development partner, Walter Ralph, Sagana Quality Consulting, ex-AbbVie Stability Director and currently Associate Editor at StabilityHub. Yours truly, John O'Neill, Pharmaceutical Stability Discussion Group Facilitator and founder of StabilityHub. And with that, let's get started with today's program. Aideen and Amy, the presentation is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello to everybody who has joined, and many thanks for joining. So today we're focusing on a part of the stability program that is often underestimated. And this is the point where samples leave one controlled environment and need to arrive safely into another. So it's not just about shipping. It's really about whether we can still defend the integrity of the stability data generated from those samples weeks, months, or even years later. So the question today that we'll keep coming back to is this. If you were asked to prove that your last stability shipment remained representative throughout transit, could you do it?
Yes, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining. We want to ask the question, why does transportation deserve attention? Everything else in a stability program is usually qualified or monitored. However, the movement of samples between the controlled environments often is not. And this matters because stability data is so important, as you know. It sets the shelf life, the labeled storage conditions, and it's what we lean on when an excursion happens. At some point in the life cycle of this study, we might need to come back to this data. So if transport compromised the sample, every decision resting on that data is weaker. Many times transit excursions are invisible unless someone was actively monitoring and recording at the time. And this is not just typical pharmaceutical distribution. It should be proportionate, risk-based control of a short but critical part of the life cycle. So where do the risks actually arise? We don't consider a stability shipment as successful because it arrived on time. It's successful because you can prove the sample remained representative of the conditions defined in the stability protocol while it was out of the controlled environment. The risk that no one sees is that the weakest point in a stability program may just be when those samples are outside of the chamber. And stability data is only as reliable as the samples used to generate it. So we have three questions we have to ask ourselves. Was the sample representative? Did anything happen during transit that could affect the result? And three, most importantly, can we prove it? I think in stability, we are very good at controlling the chamber environment. We do everything from qualifying the chambers, monitoring the conditions, documenting the alarms, and defining sample handling in our protocols. But the moment those samples leave that controlled environment, the risk profile changes. The samples may pass through things like courier depots, airports, customs, loading docks, warehouses, and of course our receiving areas. And the stability team may not always have full visibility of what happened in between. And the issue is not simply whether the shipment arrived, it's whether we can prove that the sample is still representative. So that distinction matters because the ICH guidance gives us the principles, but unfortunately not a detailed shipping procedure. So each of these steps depicted in this life cycle that you can see here on the slide contributes evidence that supports the final stability result. And transportation is often the least visible step, particularly when it comes to transporting stability samples. So where are the risks? None of these risks are foreign to us. I am sure everyone in this webinar has seen at least one of them. I think the weekend delay is pretty classic, where nothing went wrong operationally. We did everything right, but 3 days of the sample history are simply unknown. Lane changes and heat waves, we were just talking about the weather a few moments ago, are pretty similar. The packaging may have been qualified for the journey, but the sample just did not take that expected journey. The missing logger is probably the most frustrating because the shipment may have been just fine, but you can't prove it. And that's important, right? The dock hold hides in plain sight. The shipment is signed as delivered, but the sample is not in controlled storage yet. So you may not know what's happening. The common thread here is not dramatic failure. It's small gaps in timing, route control, monitoring, and ownership. And each one can chip away at how defensible the data is. This is one of those questions that sounds simple, but is surprisingly messy in practice. Who owns the samples during shipping? You'd think there'd be a clear answer, but honestly, in a lot of organizations, there just isn't one. What we see all the time is this gray zone between the company, the courier, the storage provider, and the testing sites. Everyone kind of assumes someone else is responsible. The company thinks, well, the courier's got it. The courier just thinks they're moving a box from A to B, and the storage provider doesn't know what happened before the samples arrived. So when something goes wrong, or even worse, when you need defensible data, no one can piece together the full picture. And remember, this isn't just a logistics problem. The stability data is driving decisions, big decisions. So it's important to deliberately design the model to eliminate the ambiguity. Here at Q1, it's end-to-end. It's coordination of the pickup, verifying receipt, confirming conditions before anything goes into a chamber. And it should all be backed by a very important and robust technical agreement that spells out exactly who's responsible and for what at every step. There should be no assumptions, no gray areas, and that clarity is what makes the difference. So I ask you, are you planning your route or are you just watching it? This question comes up a lot. People hear route planning, and I think they immediately picture some massive GPS tracking project with real-time dashboards and alerts going off everywhere. That's not what we're talking about here with this slide. What we're talking about is route risk assessment. Think about where the risk points are. How many handoffs are there? Could samples get stuck in customs? What's the climate like along the route? It's very hot here right now, but maybe the samples are going somewhere where it's cold. It all needs to be thought through. It's about thinking through the journey before the samples leave, not necessarily watching them every second while they're in transit. And then on the practical side, don't just pick whatever courier is cheapest or fastest. You want to select and approve couriers based on 3 things. Can they actually handle what you need? Do they have proper temperature controlled handling? And have they got a track record with stability shipments specifically? Because not all couriers are equal when it comes to this stuff. The whole point we are trying to make with this is that you need to reduce variability through planning like with the routes and using trusted partners. That way, you're not relying on trying to catch problems after they've already happened. Instead, you're designing it from the start.
Okay, so monitoring versus control. So this slide is one I really want you to sit with for a second, because this distinction catches people out all the time. Monitoring answers, did something go wrong? Whereas control answers, why is this acceptable and what action is required? You'd be surprised how many teams think they've got shipping under control because they've got a data logger in a box, but they don't. They've got monitoring, and that's not the same thing. So think about it this way. Monitoring answers one question: did something go wrong? Your loggers, your trackers, your alerts, they all tell you what happened, but it's past tense information. It's after the fact. It's helpful, sure, but it didn't stop anything from happening. And here's the kicker. If you haven't set predefined limits beforehand, you'll end up with a bunch of out-of-spec readings and absolutely no framework for figuring out what they really mean. And that is a really uncomfortable place to be. So control is on the other side of the coin. It's more forward-looking. You've got a shipping strategy. You're using qualified packaging. Your routes and your transit limits are defined before anything moves. You've also got accelerated study data backing up your acceptability criteria. So when, and not if, a deviation happens, you can look at it and say, here's why this is still acceptable, or here's the action we need to take. But you have a more defensible position. Without that control framework, monitoring data just generates questions that you're going to find it very difficult to answer. So in terms of monitoring technology then, there's no single perfect monitoring device. The perfect and most appropriate one depends on what the shipment is worth and what you would need to prove if something went wrong. So Temptail single-use loggers cover our routine stability shipments. They're calibrated, they're cheap enough to use every time, and they give a clean and simple audit trail. The trade-off is that you only learn what happened after the box is opened.
Right. And for higher value or longer international lanes, we use a product called Tive real-time trackers data as well as some other options, and they provide alerts while the shipment is still being transported. We find this is very helpful if the shipment experiences things like a customs hold or a delayed handoff. It's something you can act on now rather than go back and investigate after. So the real difference is one gives you evidence, the other gives you the chance to intervene. If we look at multi-parameter monitoring, that's a step beyond, and it earns its cost where things like humidity matter or maybe the sample is genuinely sensitive. The practical advice we would give you is to try to match the device to the risk of the lane, not to necessarily standardize one tracker for everything.
So visibility does not necessarily equal control. This is the scenario that keeps quality people awake at night. And it starts with a shipment that looked absolutely fine. Nothing was flagged, the shipment arrived. They traveled from the manufacturing site to the testing lab on time, no issues reported. 6 months later, an odd trend shows up in the data. And now you're trying to reconstruct a journey that nobody recorded. At that point, the shipment being on time is worth absolutely nothing. The only question is whether the unexpected stability result reflects the product or something that happened in transit. And without a record, you can't answer that question. You can't rule transport in, but you can't rule it out either. And that's the difference between visibility and control. So knowing where a shipment is not the same as being able to prove what it experienced while it was getting there. Now, the fix is fairly routine, but it's effective. Have enough data, criteria agreed in advance, and a clear route for deciding whether the data is still fit for use or not. It's best practice to work with your customers early so you can define transportation requirements as part of stability storage, rather than treating it as a separate afterthought. A typical qualification process follows a structured sequence. So from defining the required storage conditions through to challenging the proposed transport solution under realistic operation conditions. And where qualification identifies any unacceptable risk, the route, the packing config, the monitoring strategy, or the acceptance criteria can be revised before transport.
Thank you, Aideen. We'll take a little break here before we go into a case study, and I'll take this opportunity to invite those who are new to Stability Hub to visit our website, stabilityhub.com, and check out our featured publications, regulations, events, suppliers, interactive forum, job opportunities, and more. While there, sign up on the drop-down form for our free monthly newsletter to see what's new. As part of the Pharmaceutical Stability Discussion Group, or PSDG for short, Stability Hub has resumed in-person PSDG meetings where attenders can spend parts of 3 days asking questions, sharing information, touring facilities, meeting vendors and learning their services, and networking to gain lifelong professional contacts and friends. We had a very successful meeting in May and are looking for companies in the US that would like to host future meetings at their facilities. If you'd like to learn more about attending or hosting such a meeting, send an email to stabilityhub.com/contact. Stability Hub is a not-for-profit information service to our industry and is operated by volunteers. If you'd like to be involved more broadly in your industry and have an hour or so each week or even a month, we could benefit from your participation. Send a note through stabilityhub.contact and there's a link there for more information. And now back to our topic. Thank you.
Okay, so we move on to a case study for shipping validation. So this is what qualifying a lane actually looks like in practice. There's 6 basic steps. It starts with the condition the samples are meant to be held at, because everything downstream is judged against that. Then there's the route. Review the seasons, the dwell times, customs, the site opening hours, weekend exposure, etc. So most failures live in this step rather than in the packaging step. The criteria to be set comes before the packaging, and this is a deliberate order. Decide what good looks like and what triggers an investigation before you choose a solution. Packaging and monitoring then follows the risk. So choose passive or active logger or real time, depending on the duration and the value of the shipment. And step 6 is often the one people skip, and it's about qualifying seasonally. A lane qualified in February is not automatically qualified in July. And as the climate is changing and getting warmer, this is something that we need to consider very seriously. Our customers know their product and its sensitivities. We know the lanes, the storage side, and where these shipments can actually become unstuck. So my advice would be to get into it early. Agree the responsibility for each step. Keep the evidence in one place so it holds up when somebody asks about it later. And transport will deviate from a plan. Even a well-qualified lane will deviate eventually, whether that's customs, weather, a route change, a courier error, a failed unit, something is guaranteed to happen. That's just life. But the instinct is to manage the shipment. The real question, however, is whether the data coming out of those samples can still carry the decisions that we hang on it. And deviations are never equal. So, for example, 2 hours, 10 degrees above a target might be nothing for one product, and it might be detrimental for another. These 7 factors listed here are what actually decide that. So the duration of the event, the magnitude of the excursion, the product itself and its stability profile, how the packaging performed, what monitoring data you have, where you are in the study, whether it's at the beginning, whether it's at the end, whether historical data exists. Notice that only some of these are about the event itself. The rest are about what you can show. This is the point of the band at the bottom here. A shipment with complete monitoring data and a genuine excursion is usually easier to defend than a shipment that arrived fine, but without a record at all. You can always assess an excursion, but you can't assess a blank. So the practical ask is predefined criteria and a clear decision route agreed before anything goes wrong. So deciding what's acceptable after the event is very difficult to defend. So know your sample tolerance. This slide is only about the tolerance, not about the journey itself. The journey along the top is just context. You've got your manufacturing site, your road leg, your air freight, final delivery, laboratory receipt. It shows where a deviation is likely to happen. But the real question is, what can the sample itself tolerate? So take a 2-hour excursion to 10 degrees above the target temperature. For one product, it's absolutely insignificant. It's not going to make a blind bit of difference. But for another product, it is potentially very, very important. Same excursion, same duration, completely different conclusion because the tolerance is different. So the second half of the point is evidence. A shipment with complete environmental monitoring data is far easier to assess than one with no record of the conditions in transit. You can hold a documented excursion against a known tolerance and reach a decision. You can't do that with a blank. And that's what the dial is showing. Green, amber, and red are not properties of the excursion here. They're the excursion measured against what the product can actually take. And most of that is decided before the shipment moves, when the tolerance and the monitoring strategy are set. So what lessons have we learned from GDP transport? So stability shipments are rarely inspected as a standalone activity. So the useful move is to borrow from where transport is inspected hard and apply it proportionally. So these are real quotations from HPRA findings on GDP transport, HPRA being the regulatory body in Ireland. Now, not because we are running commercial distribution, but because they show exactly which assumptions do not survive scrutiny. So they fall into 2 buckets. On the left here, it's all about inadequate transport validation. Companies are running validation studies that don't reflect real-world conditions. There's empty boxes, stationary vehicles, no seasonal considerations, for example. And in some cases, there were reports of studies being approved as passing, even though there were temperature excursions during the study itself, without any impact assessment being carried out. On the right here, it's about equipment qualification, or the lack thereof. Freezers used for gel pack preparation that were never qualified. Shipper systems accepted across all sizes based on testing only one size. Temperature probes without proper calibration. And companies relying on pre-validated systems that were never actually verified using their own site equipment. So there's a common pattern here, and that's the pattern of assumption. People assume their validation is good enough. They assume their equipment is qualified. And assume pre-validated means site validated. But don't be fooled, inspectors are not making those same assumptions.
So we have the same idea here on the FDA side. If we look at the 483 observations that they've posted, and again, we're not running commercial distribution, but the thinking that we see from them tells us where risk-based control of stability samples needs to be. I think the shift worth noting is that transport is no longer treated as a separate logistics activity. It should sit inside of the quality system. It should be treated with the same scrutiny and the same expectations. The FDA seems to be paying especially close attention to a few areas, and those are temperature-sensitive products, anything going into long-term or stability-critical storage, and anywhere you're using contracted partners for storage or distribution. It's basically anywhere where there is a handoff or a risk of losing control.
Okay, so now we've seen the problems and we've talked about them. So let's talk about what the HPRA and the FDA actually expects you to do about them. And honestly, None of this is groundbreaking. It's about getting the basics right and doing them consistently. And when you boil it down, the regulatory bodies, be it HPRA, FDA, MHRA, they're really saying three things. One, make your validation real. Test actual routes, actual conditions, actual worst cases. Don't run a study with an empty box sitting in a car park and call it validated. Two, qualify your equipment, all of it. The freezer, the shippers, the probes, absolutely everything. And three, write it down. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. We all know that one, right? I personally like the puzzle analogy here because that's really what it is. You can nail your validation, but if your probes aren't calibrated, then you've got a gap. You can have perfect documentation, but if your routes were never risk assessed, then there's a problem. Every little piece of the jigsaw has to fit together to make it work. The message from the regulatory bodies is this, really. Combine all the pieces and get the basics right. It's not about fancy technology or complex systems. It's about having a solid, documented, defensible approach to transport. So this is everything we've covered so far, pulled into 5 things you can actually put into a procedure. The first one is planning. This is the one that pays for itself, really. Deciding the condition, the acceptance criteria, and who approves them before the sample moves removes most of the arguments later on. Packaging has to hold up for the duration of the shipment and the season that you actually ship in, not the one you tested in. What might be useful in January in the snow might be no use to you in a heat wave in July. Route assessment is where the hidden risk generally lives. Dwell points, handoffs, and the fact that a lane changes when the provider or the season changes. Monitoring proportionate to risk. Enough to demonstrate the conditions, not necessarily gold plating every shipment. And documentation is what converts all of it into something reviewable months later, when nobody will actually remember the shipment. The chain along the bottom is the argument in one line. Transport evidence gives confidence in the sample. The sample gives confidence in the data. And the data is what shelf life decisions rest on. Take out the first link, and the whole chain is assumption rather than evidence.
Right. So before we let you go, I want to leave you with something to take back to your teams. This is not just a summary, it's a challenge. I want you to think about what happens the next time someone in your organization says, are you going to treat that as a stability event, or will it be treated as a logistics task? Because that distinction right there is what really matters. It's where the risk lives. So 5 things I want you to take away. Number 1, shipping is part of your stability program. Number 2, planning has to come before monitoring, not the other way around. Your packaging and your routes need to be driven by the protocol, not by convenience. Ownership must be crystal clear at every handoff. And lastly, I think this is important. If you can bring shipping under the same roof as your sample management, you can close gaps that a lot of organizations don't even realize they have. That's what we've built here at Q1. Shipping is not just bolted onto storage, but shipping is treated as an integrated part of the stability program itself. And honestly, once you see it work that way, you can't unsee the gaps in the old approach. So here's my ask. When you get back to work, pick one of these 5 areas that I just talked through. Just one, I think it's fine. Ask, how are we actually handling this? And if the answer makes you a little uncomfortable, I think that's good. I mean, that's where the conversation needs to start. So that was everything from our slide deck, but we'll turn it back over to John for some more questions and additional information.
Sure, thank you, Amy. Remind people that you're welcome to ask questions through the chat feature. And we have a whole lot of other things to do. If you could go back one slide, that's a little premature on the conclusion part. just to your previous slide, if you would. Yeah, perfect. So they ask if you have any questions, and while we're waiting for that, I'd like to ask a few of our speakers and our panel members, because I think as we get into some of these, people can identify with some situations that they have or might have in the future. We spoke a lot about transport-related risks. Is there a particular one that turns up the most number of times that people tend to overlook? And this could go for speakers or panelists.
But I can take that one. I think
Sure.
one of the interesting things that we've seen over the year is that the biggest risks are rarely catastrophic. I kind of mentioned this in my slides earlier. They're more often these smaller gaps that people have, gaps in planning, gaps in documentation, or maybe in ownership that only become apparent when someone needs to go back and investigate a trend or defend a decision later. I spoke through some of the examples earlier. I can mention some of those again here. I think one of them is a risk would be assuming that on-time delivery means the shipment remained within acceptable conditions. Doesn't mean the transport history is fully understood or that it's documented. Another major risk would be failing to consider what happens between the handoffs. So it may come into delays in customs or in the warehouse. And a lot of that can introduce more risk than the actual shipment itself, which is why that pre-planning is so important. I would also say that assuming a transport lane remains qualified indefinitely is a big one. I think Aideen kind of mentioned this earlier, where we know there's changes in seasons, changes in couriers or routes, maybe the packing configurations have changed. Everything, all of these little changes, I guess, should be considered because they could affect the performance. So the organizations that manage transport most successfully aren't necessarily the ones with the most technology per se. They're the ones who have a clear risk-based procedure and can confidently answer that question about, can we still defend the data generated from the samples?
I think you raised an excellent point there that it's great to have some kind of procedure, almost like reviewing an SOP. It's reviewing your shipping procedure instead of just a general SOP. If there's a change, you review it. And if there's a period of time has gone by and you want to double check to make sure no changes have occurred unnoticed, it's like every year, every 2 years, go back and recheck that procedure again. Would be good. You mentioned customs. And I had an experience, a bad experience with customs, and that some samples got delayed in customs and they didn't bother to inform anybody from the shipping point of view or the receiving point of view. Is there a way you can have eyes and ears in customs facilities and the tarmacs of airports, that kind of thing? I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I think I've heard that you can hire contracted agents that go into these facilities and check from time to time, and they have relationships with the airport and customs people where they're known and they are known that they'll be asking those kind of questions. Yeah, anyone have any experience along those lines?
Well, I can add something here, but if someone else has more to add, they can. I know that sometimes we'll use an approved vendor who will do a lot of the customs clearance in advance so that you've already got the paperwork approved. They've already kind of looked at all of the information you're going to be sending with your shipment. And that way, once it gets there, it goes through customs much more smoothly. I won't say that means you'd never have an issue, but there definitely are companies who will do that.
So it sounds like that's a wise move to develop those kind of sources and then also see what kind of services they can provide. I wanted to ask Emily, since you deal with clinical trial supplies, is there anything specific in your area that you notice with samples and the way they're shipped? Is there anything different about the people in the clinical places that are different than the commercial plants where we tend to send our shipments?
Yeah, it's really funny that you bring that up because when you're in the clinical space, a lot of sponsors haven't thought through the whole shipping, um, the plan and the lanes. I recently worked on a project where they were shipping labeled drug product into the clinic and were really curious as to why their samples were constantly receiving excursions. That's because they didn't think about, oh, we're shipping from a cool climate to Southern California where it is not so cool. So, doing those from a clinical perspective for sponsors to do those shipping validations, not just for their stability samples, but for their clinical trial material is really important because you, in this space, you get to the point where it's not just impacting your stability program, but it's going to impact your patient. So as a stabilitarian, really urge your management to look at those types of studies. One other thing that I will, we've talked about the, you know, how it's a sample is being handled from point A to point B. One of the things that I like to talk about is doing those studies that support time out of the controlled condition. So one of the products I worked on in my past life was a refrigerated product. So taking into account how much time that specific product is going to spend outside refrigerated conditions and build those stability studies that will support your distribution chain, not just within the plant and the depot itself, but while you're shipping and having those limits set and it's some sort of a guidance document is also really important.
Thank you, Emily. I suspected that would be the case. It'd be a little bit different there. You mentioned time out of refrigeration. That kind of takes me over to the whole topic of stability budgets, not so much monetary budgets as more time and temperature budgets. And I remember from my career, there'd be multiple times people would ask us, we were just out of range on temperature for such and such a number of hours. Can you tell us if we're okay? And we would start from scratch every single time and write a new report and explanation. And we suddenly wised up and decided we could prepare these things in advance with a little bit of data. I was going to ask, is it common that people are starting to use stability budgets and have prepared reports so they can simply say so many hours, so many degrees now fits this situation, and our response number XYZ from 2024 would cover this nicely, and then off you go. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I will say, we're getting into this space now where, 30, 35 years ago, everything seemed to be, a controlled room temperature, kind of storage. You've got your pills everywhere, but now we have this influx of biologic drugs that require different storage. You have more complex, combination products. So that whole, I feel like we kind of need to adjust our attitude towards how we do those studies at the same time as the types of products that we're evaluating evolve. Because the whole we're gonna do, 25C for, 36 months and only measure certain conditions, that's not really applicable. I know we mentioned as the climate is changing, the way we strategize how we do our studies and what we're looking at also changes. So we have a lot of variables that I feel are kind of important at this juncture as we start to evolve in the stability space.
Okay, thank you. Let me send one Walter's way with his vast experience as an international overseer of stability studies and doing a lot of shipping of samples. And then once you've answered Walter, maybe the others can chime in. When it's clear upon sample arrival that a shipping mishap has occurred, besides an investigation, what's the optimal course of action to take with the samples?
Yeah, it's a good one. Just like you would have you define various levels of an excursion for the chamber, you can also define various levels of a mishap. If your data was simply missing or somehow got deleted, that would probably be your lowest level, versus your sample is melted, or even worse, your sample is just completely missing. And this may be a little controversial, but I would propose on your lowest levels, you may be able to simply request a new sample. If a sample is available not even have to have an investigation, have a process where you simply document that the data was missing and a new sample was able to be sent and you received it and everything's fine. So that would be your lowest level. Ideally, it works out. If it doesn't work out, then yeah, you would have, if the sender does not have additional sample, or there is no way of doing that, then you would end up needing to investigate. But working with any means possible to find that sample or find another anyway, so first I would say is developing a hierarchy of mishap levels, as the word you use.
Sounds good. Yeah, I know there's been times where I recommended throwing out samples based on the record I saw just from the temp tails and the monitoring devices, and got lots and lots of feedback and discussion from my higher ups who wanted me to test it. And I was thinking, just simply based on the ridiculous extremes that the samples went through, that even if you tested it and it showed it was fine, there would be all kinds of questions raised about the exposure levels. I never did find out whether or not they tested. I was thinking that smacked of testing into compliance at some level to do that. But it's a tough battle, because if you want, as a stabilitarian, to discard the samples or ask for new ones, sometimes you'll get feedback from those that are holding the purse strings that they really want to use those materials if they can. Anybody else want to comment on anything along those lines of what do you do with the samples? Do you throw them away? Do you find the right level of justification? Start over. Maybe somebody's not allowed to throw away a sample, particularly if it's, let's say, a medical device where they're extremely expensive, extremely complex to do that.
Oh, you just said it smacks of testing into compliance, and I completely agree, because you had that attitude of, let's just see what happens, and if it doesn't work, then okay, it didn't work. But that should put off alarm bells in an inspector. But your investigations could also adequately provide a rationale and a testing plan for moving forward that might permit that, or at least make it get by the inspector's concerns. But
pre-established, I think, is the best term here. If you pre-established it, you're not making it up just to fit the situation. I think you have a good justification in defending your process.
Mm-hmm. One thing that strikes me, though, when you say that is, in my past life, our bigger concern with shipment wasn't necessarily, sorry, I don't disagree with everything that Q1 has said here, but we were more concerned with the risk of losing a study, or the risk of delaying a filing, et cetera, versus was my sample representative? So that's just another concern here. Another facet to be worried about is just the cost and the impact of ruining a study. So we would go with, FedEx has what they call custom critical shipping, and it's extremely expensive. You have two people that never leave the truck for 24 hours, and so you've got the security, you've got a validated shipping system, all that. It was very expensive, but it provided the security that was needed on the management side, as opposed to only assuring that the sample arrived representative of what we were intending.
Thank you. I have a question for Q1 Scientific. When you investigate unexpected stability trends, not necessarily suspecting anything at the very beginning, how often does the root cause turn out to come from transporting samples? Is that something you find to be very high up in the cause of a trend when it comes to something that you weren't thinking was going to go wrong?
I'll take that one, John. So generally, transport would not necessarily be the first identified root cause of, say, an unexpected stability trend. people will often look at lab errors, analytical method variability, raw material variability, so, something like that. But there might not be necessarily an obvious excursion, and it might not necessarily be the first thing that people think about when it comes to an out of trend in their stability data. But have they looked at where the samples were spending some of their time during the transport? Did they look at delays that might have occurred during customs? Any monitoring? Did they account for the seasonal variance when they were doing the validation in the beginning? So it doesn't have the same focus a lot of the time as the lab would have, but it does need to be looked at, because often it can be a hidden goldmine for an issue that needs to be addressed.
Mhm. Yeah. Another one for our panel regarding calibration of devices. It was in your slides, and I think that's a good point, and it was one that we've debated over the years, because we used to use a great deal of a product called temp tails. We were challenged by the FDA during one inspection that did we calibrate the temp tails, and we did a quick poll around industry. We weren't finding anybody that was doing that, simply because the temp tails came with a certificate saying that they had all been qualified and tested. Now that wasn't individually, but that was as a product. And so we did a lot of wrestling back and forth with the inspectors over that one. And I think in the end, we agreed to test a few here and there. But I was kind of curious, that was quite a while ago. Is there any update on that about the calibration of your monitoring devices? I could see it for anything that's computer-based. If it has an active thermometer, those kind of things. But if it's pre-built into a device like a temp tail, has anything changed on that when it comes to calibration? Could be for any panel members or speakers.
We definitely had the certificate as you're describing. It was an individual certificate. If we ordered 10 temp tails, for example, it would be a certificate listing each one individually with their own calibration date and the expiry. So we were careful to be tracking that, make sure that each one had a sticker saying when it expired as well. So that sufficed for what we needed. We didn't perform any additional calibration on top of that.
Okay. Any others?
Yeah, I'd say my answer would be the same. I mean, it does come with the certification as what we mentioned, TIVE as well, and they have a similar program for those where they'll have an expiration date, and you can go online and get the certification for those as well.
Mhm.
So we qualified the supplier, but we haven't gone and done any additional certifications of the devices themselves beyond using the certification that came with it. So that's interesting that you were called out on that and had to go additional steps.
Yeah, it was unusual, and that turns out that's one of the driving forces behind the discussion group. We love to hear from companies around the world for all these weird things that turn up that inspectors ask them at this point in time, that it's unheard of in most companies, but it does happen. And so it helps us to think a little bit in advance, what would we do if we were asked that question in our shop? One of the things that, talking about temp tails, came out not necessarily as a challenge in an audit, but it was a question that was raised that we would take a temp tail out of a refrigerator and slap it into a box and ship it off halfway around the world, and the temp tail would start doing its duty. But it showed that in the first hour or so, it was out of specifications. And it wasn't due to anything about the conditions of the shipping. It had to do with the fact that we just whisked it out of a refrigerator, slammed it into a box, and sent it off. We kind of shot ourselves in the foot because we were documenting that we were out of specifications. And so we developed a strong program of preconditioning to make sure that the temp tail was right about where it needed to be at the start of the shipping program to do that. I'm not sure if other people ran into that. We have a submitted question that we'll take here next. As lyophilized preparations are subject to moisture ingress and protein denaturation if a peptide during transport. Any suggestions for cold chain transport for these sensitive preparations? Is there a silica gel packet anyone has used? So lyophilized, I'm assuming refrigerated is a condition for normal storage. Uh, Anybody want to hop up and take one of those question or that question? We won't all jump at once. I think Walter mentioned custom critical was one of the items or agents that were used. They can monitor well, but the other part is packing. You can pack things now with even with liquid nitrogen if you can withstand the freezing aspect of it. In other cases, there's places that put the cold source in one part of a box with a fan, battery-powered fan that blows the cold air over into the other side. And it actually monitors a little bit of what the temperature is. It blows a little bit more if it gets too warm. There are such things like that. I'm not sure about the silica gel packets. I'm thinking of when I go on vacation and put a bunch of sliced meat into a container with some cold packs to make it last. So we can use cold packs in our products, but then again, monitoring to make sure that they've lasted longer, validating them in advance to that we can really expect that they'll last. I think that's about the extent of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, one of the things that really comes in handy is someone you were talking earlier about a freight forwarder or the service of someone to make sure that your ice is still there, or that you limit the delays in customs. So I'm not, the question's a little vague. We don't know how far you're shipping it, how long the shipment is, what the exact temperature is. So certainly need to, hopefully you can validate that shipping lane if it's something you're doing often. And then also the key would be to make sure you've got a person, a freight forwarder or someone in the line of that shipment to ensure that it's staying, that the ice is, the dry ice is replenished or the desiccant is replaced, et cetera, as needed.
There's a follow-up note that the silica gel was there as a desiccant. So I would say, yes, we've done that kind of thing in the past, and desiccants need to be kind of, not sure how precisely you can qualify them, but challenge them as close as you can to your conditions of use and see if they're protective or not is a great idea. Let's talk a little bit about courier qualifications. I don't know if Q1 has some ideas about the courier qualifications. I think it's a good idea to have an alternate courier, so have more than one qualified in case one is busy or down. One of the qualifications steps that was not part of what my company did when they qualified a courier, and that's that they failed to prohibit them from subbing out the job, let's say, to another contractor. And so the first courier knew fully all our obligations and regulations and rules, but they also had no qualms about subcontracting, and that subcontractor did not get any of the requirements. And so they just went out on their own and did what they wanted to in transferring the product. Let's see, from Walter, he'd like to hear from participants regarding sample transport issues in their audit experience. Have any of the participants heard of an inspector questioning sample transport processes? Can you share your story? So if you have such a thing, you could unmute and describe that to us. We have about 4 more minutes, maybe 3 or 4, if there is such a story there. Sample transport and audits.
I say mine isn't specific to stability samples, but more towards commercial distribution. I have been part of both audits and inspections where the auditors and inspectors do request to see those validations, and the items that they're looking for are a lot of what we've discussed today. So I mean, especially when you're doing cold chain, making sure that those routes are validated, the shipping containers are validated. I know we had these big things that looked almost like the containers that they would put on commercial airliners for luggage and whatnot. So making sure, I mean, I think we called them envirotainers. So making sure that those are validated and maintained in a validated state. That's something that, as putting on my auditor hat, we just talked about a subcontractor not being qualified for, first party vendor. That's something that, definitely make sure if you're farming out, your shipping to somebody else, you've or not, sorry, not validated, you've qualified their process for how they qualify their vendors, because ultimately there's going to be that, I hate to call it a chain reaction, but if some, if they're not following the appropriate processes and procedures, that's going to directly impact your samples. So doing that due diligence on the front end is key.
Yeah, I think you mentioned envirotainers is one of the commercial things available.
Hmm.
It's kind of nice when we get the opportunities to go out to big trade shows where there's all kinds of suppliers and different sorts of products that are out there. That's a good place to find some people that like the ones that have envirotainers and make a contact, maybe get a demonstration, maybe have them to your plant, but to at least know about these kind of things and be available there. I think way back when we did have an Envirotainer representative come to a PSGG meeting as a vendor, and it was very entertaining. Also, FedEx Custom Critical sent some representatives once. So just finding out about the kind of services that are out there, it doesn't necessarily have to be the ones that you're talking to, but just to be aware of who they are and what they're doing is a good move. Let's see, we'll take one more here. Live transportation trackers was mentioned in the presentation. There was a commercial name I think Aideen mentioned, but I was kind of curious, and Walter mentioned actually having people watch that. But I was wondering how often people feel comfortable not having any kind of monitoring there. If we follow what Aideen was saying, that maybe more in the riskier avenues, we want to spend more money in monitoring, and maybe on the less risky ones, either rely on our validation or use something less expensive like tracking devices like Temptails, different opportunities.
Again, this seems a little odd, but I was part of a large company, and we actually were willing to ship overnight via FedEx without monitoring, and that was our allowance as long as it was overnight.
Uh-huh.
But that I'm embarrassed to say it, but it worked. And
No, it's good. It's good. That's relying on your pre-validated systems and your stability budget. So with that, I think we need to flip to the next slide and talk a little bit about what's coming up. Our time is, let's see, one more slide forward.
Yeah.
There we go. Our time has flown. I'd like to take a moment to highlight some upcoming programs. We ask that you join us again in September for a webinar associated with the September newsletter article that comes out on September 9th. And September 9th is a great day for a great stability feat, such as the one that the ladies are about to tell us about. One more slide forward.
Yeah, so hopefully today has sparked something for you. Maybe it was something you've been interested, something you've been struggling with. I hope that it was helpful, but we did want to flag something that ties directly into what we've been talking about. Every year, Q1 Scientific hosts a Stability Studies Conference. We're now heading into our 5th year in Ireland, and we're bringing this conference to Durham for the first time in the US on September 9th. We're very excited about it. We think it's the kind of event where conversations just like this one are going to keep going. We'll have sample management specialists from the analytical perspective and quality perspectives, all in the same room, tackling similar questions around stability, compliance, risk management in a really open and practical way. I think the details are right here on the slide, so feel free to scan that QR code or go to the website that's listed there. I think if topics like transport risk or audit defensibility are something you're working through, this is where those conversations are going to continue. We'd be really excited to be able to host you that day and connect.
Okay, thank you. We'll look forward to that. If you could go to the last slide. I'll mention, I see there's another submitted question. What we'll do, or since we're out of time, we'll take that and put it over onto our website in the forum. I'll post it anonymously, and then we'll see what kind of responses we can give from our panel and anybody else who wants to comment. So stabilityhub.com will take care of that. As we bring our program to a conclusion, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Q1 Scientific, our speakers, Aideen Glynn and Amy Trinchard, our panelists, Emily Dickinson and Walter Rout, and you, our great audience, for your attendance today, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.